So we're on innate, and we had defined these before, but I just want to review them because they're important terms, right? So innate is even though your immunity, right, it all works together. When we talk about it, sometimes we talk about the components that you're born with, right? Innate means born with. So these are working day one. They're even working when you're in your mom's uterus.
I have a question.
Last time?
The cascade of events. You have listed here dilation of the vessels, migration of leukocytes, and clotting. Are those the events, or are the acute inflammation part of the cascade of events?
Okay. Let me open up the other one. Good. All right. So for inflammation, right, it says outline the process, focusing on the factors that initiate the process and the outcomes of inflammation, right? That's what you guys need to understand about inflammation. So the purpose, right? These are some signs and some things that happen along the way, right? So we talk about that cascade of events, what happens first, right? You have the dilation of the blood vessels, right? Getting the cells into the area, them actually moving into the area. Other things that will happen is, clotting factors will wall off that particular area. There's two different types of inflammation, right? One that takes care of the problem, that's acute, right? Long-term chronic inflammation, they're not able to take care of the problem. And we talked about two different types of cell death, one that elicits inflammation and one does not. So, right, so this is diagramming even the effects. Right, you're going to have that signaling that happens in the cells heading to the area. Right, and we're going to talk about some of the specific components as we go through cell communication. And as we saw, phagocytic cells like macrophages and neutrophils are going to be gobbling this stuff up. So I was trying to see. So you initiate the process, right? You have that cell signaling. The cells are going to head to that area, and when they're heading, you have these cardinal signs of that swelling, the leaking of those blood vessels, the redness, the increased blood flow, the heat because of the increased blood flow, the pain sometimes associated with that swelling in that particular area. Right? What's the purpose of all of this? Is to get to the invaders and keep them in that particular area. But of course, right, it can be damaging sometimes, and we talked about that as well. This is a very important process, right, for your immune response. Those cells actually going to the area where they're called to, where they're needed. So the same thing with phagocytosis, right? Make sure that you know all of the steps, right? And this picture is a really good diagram, right, of all the steps, right? The movement to the area of the cells, them recognizing and attaching to the foreign objects, the formation of that phagosome that fuses with the lysosome to form the phagolysosome where the digestion happens, right? And then getting rid of, spitting out exocytosis. And then the difference between macrophages and neutrophils. These are two very specialized phagocytic cells that we've talked about so far. So you're born with this ability, right, to have inflammation. You're adaptive, you're born with as well, right? But as the name implies, it adapts and changes over time. So even some of the components that we talk about now are going to be necessary for helping that part of your immune system that adapts and changes over time, right? And that has specific components that are only produced by that system. It's me. It's because it's on the desktop. It's vibrating quite loud. I'm not answering my phone during class. Okay. It's not my son's school, so whoever it is can wait. Okay. So antigen is a term that we're going to really use a lot when we talk about adaptive. And what it actually means is antibody generator. Now, antibodies are a product of our adaptive immune response. But even though they're a product of our adaptive immune response, they can help out components that we're going to talk about today in the innate response. So antibodies are actually proteins made by your immune system, specifically the adaptive component of your immune system. So we're not going to get to their specificities and stuff until we get to adaptive, but we are going to mention them here. Antigens are things that antibodies will bind to, right? They're foreign substances. They could be bacteria, pieces of bacteria, foreign proteins, viruses, protozoa, you name it, anything foreign. Pollen for some of us that have allergies, right? Anything foreign. Now, the most easiest thing for us to study when we were first studying the immune system were these antibodies, right? They're found in your blood. They're found throughout your body. You produce large amounts of them in your mucus, in your tears, in your saliva. So it was very easy to purify these from the human body, see how they were interacting specifically with things, right? They bind to specific antigens. Right? So we're talking E. coli 0157, that specific strain, right? Your body could make antibodies that binds to just that specific strain of E. coli even, right? A particular virus, a particular protein. So it's a very specific interaction. Although nowadays the term antigen isn't just things that your immune system makes antibodies against. It's anything that your immune system makes a response to. So some scientists have switched to saying immunogens, right? Referring to that you get an immune response generated by this substance, whatever it might be. I stick to the old term, right? Just because it's what's mostly you're going to see anyways, right? Just know that although originally it was just given that term because we knew our body made antibodies against it. But anything foreign, our immune system is going to respond to. And there's multiple different ways in which the immune system can respond, other than just antibodies. That's just one of the things in our arsenal. Okay, so we'll use these terms a lot, antigen and antibody, so it's important to know and distinguish between the two. Okay? Well, we're going to say them a lot. Almost like gram-positive and gram-negative. Trust me, it hasn't gone away. All right, so the essential components of our innate defenses. We have first-line defenses. One of the most important is our anatomical barriers. These physical barriers that stop these antigens from getting into our body. And so we'll talk about that in more detail, right, throughout this lecture. Sensory systems, right? Being able to recognize, have those receptors on our cells that recognize a bacteria has gotten it, right? I see peptidoglycan. I see lipopolysaccharide. This means invader. This means bacteria. The complement system is a series of proteins, and this is the animations that I really suggest that you watch before Wednesday's class, because I'm not going to play them in class. All right, so if that type of presentation helps you, definitely look over that before class next time. Phagocytes, right? So here we're talking about the cells that can do phagocytosis. So we talked about two major ones last time. What are two names, specific names to white blood cells that can do phagocytosis? One starts with an M, macrophages. The other one starts with an N, neutrophils. And we get to all say it at the same time. Good job. All right. So those are your main guys, right? The main ones, right? That process is very important, right? Because just like inflammation, right? Those cells getting to the area, them just being there isn't enough. They've got to devour and destroy those invaders. That process of phagocytosis is very important to our very first response to things that get in. And again, how do we know that the stuff has gotten in, right? We have receptors. Those are just basically alarms, though. How the cells actually know and communicate that this has happened is via chemical messages we call cytokines. So one of them that we introduced last time, mentioned briefly, that most people are familiar with is histamine. It's a major inflammatory cytokine, right? When our cells, our mast cells, release that, you really get that influx, you get that inflammation of cells into the area. So just like our endocrine system works on hormones, those chemical messages specific to that system of our body, your cytokines are almost like your hormones of your immune system. They are the chemical communication between your white blood cells and your cells in general. There's probably a book about this thick too, on all the cytokines that we know so far. You thought hormones were bad when you took A&P, anatomy and physiology, right? Cytokines would drive you loopy. And we're discovering more and more, right, and more in detail of what each one is doing and what it's communicating with and what it's interacting with. So the good news for you guys is that we're not going to go into that much detail. Only one of them, one group of cytokines are we going to really talk about, and that's interferon. And that one's really important for viral infections.
So neutrophils can
not neutrophils. Mast cells and basophils have histamine in them. So fever too is a normal response of our body, this increase in core body temperature. It's meant to make you really warm, right? Because what happens when we get too hot? No, it's actually not why we want to get hot. What happens to microorganisms when they get too hot? Let me put it that way. They die, right? That's one of the main reasons why we cook our food, right? So if we get too hot, we could kill those bacteria potentially. The bad news with that is that we could kill ourselves in the process too if we get too hot. A lot of times when your fever goes uncontrolled, it's not because you're controlling it. There are some microorganisms that can induce fever as well, right? Trick our body into getting too hot. Obviously, the heat does not bother them. Why they would want to potentially kill us, though, considering we're their host in their home, doesn't seem to make much sense either, right? But it does happen. But fever is a normal, innate immune response, something you're born with the ability to be able to do. And it's meant to be protective. But just as we saw with phagocytosis, right, all of our mechanisms can kind of even be turned against us, right? There are pathogens out there that can get past these layers of protection, past these sensory systems, right? Avoid phagocytosis. And that's why we still get sick. That's why we still see disease, right? Some of them are quite powerful despite this very protective system, right? We still have robberies, right? Even though we have cops and alarms and dogs and all these things, right? These things still happen, okay? So the same thing for our immune system. The bad guys have found a way around our protection system, right? And some of them are very, very good at it, to the point where they're lethal, right? That they can kill us. So our first line of defense are our actual barriers, right? Actually blocking entry, right? Imagine the fence around your house, the locked door, right? These are physical barriers. For us, that would be our skin. And for all of our openings, they're bathed in mucus. This is a gelatinous, sticky substance, right, that we produce, and it's meant to trap them and not allow them to enter any further into the body. If they breach, right, if they get past that mucus layer, if they get past our skin layer, which our skin is really good protection, but as you know, it still is vulnerable, right? We still get cuts, scrapes, right? That leaves an entry point for infection. That's why you always want to make sure that whenever you have a cut or a scrape that it's clean, right? Keep an eye on it. make sure it doesn't get infected. If they get past those systems, on the surface of our cells, we can recognize specific patterns that are common among the things that bother us, right? Bacteria, their peptidoglycan, their lipopolysaccharide for those gram negatives, the flagellin protein. These different things, we have surface receptors as well as we have endosomes that have receptors on them as well. So inside of our cells, we have receptors. Phagocytosis, right? Inside, right, our cells that have engulfed something. Even within the cytoplasm of the cell, so we have multiple layers of protection. The membrane, membranes within the cell. Within the cytoplasm, there are receptors. Right? We have alarms everywhere. And then in addition, we have a protein system referred to as the complement system. This is outside of our cells. This is in the liquid of our body. It floats all throughout our blood. It is found in your tissue fluids as well. Notice the response that when these are triggered. Most of them are going to elicit an inflammatory response, right? It's going to call other cells to the area, right? A bad guy has gotten in me or gotten in the area. Come help us out, right? For every single one of these, inflammatory, inflammatory, inflammatory. Calling the white blood cells to that specific area where this invasion has happened, where this breach has happened. Notice for inside of our cells, as I said earlier, one special group of cytokines, interferon, are very important for viruses, right? So this is a specific type of response to viruses, this interferon response that we're going to talk about next time. We mentioned before in one of our previous videos opsonization. This process is a process of molecules actually binding to the surface of a pathogen like a bacteria or a virus. And in doing so, it tags it for destruction by phagocytic cells. Phagocytic cells have receptors for our opsonins. The two main opsonins we have are a protein produced by complement that we're going to talk about next time. All the complement proteins are numbered and are given the letter C for the designation of complement. And the one that is an opsonin, and we'll go over it again, is C3b. It's actually a piece of the C3 protein of complement system. It breaks into two pieces. The good news is that the B component, B starts with the word bind starts with the letter B, right? So they actually bind to the surface. So always remember C3b binds to the surface, right? It is a very strong opsonin. Antibodies produced by our immune system as well bind to the surface, right? Or to proteins or anything foreign. And when they do that, they tag it for destruction by our phagocytic cells. Our phagocytic cells have receptors for our antibodies and have receptors for C3b. The complement system, as we're going to see next time, and as you guys will watch in the animations, can produce a series of proteins that create a hole in the membrane of foreign cells. And when it does that, it's going to cause the cell to lyse. It basically just pokes big old holes in that cell. So, as you can see, we have the barriers, but if they're breached, right, our alarms are going to go off, right, and our immune system's going to respond. The most common response is inflammation, right? Although sometimes you won't see it, it's happening. So, in addition to those physical barriers, your skin and your mucous membranes, you have antimicrobial substances that are associated with those barriers that are also going to help defend. And then you have normal microbiota, normal microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, that live within and on your body that actually help protect you by them being there. So your skin, as we know, very difficult to penetrate. There's actually very few organisms out there, so few that I don't even have any of them memorized, that can actually penetrate your skin on their own. They have to get in. The only way they can get in is if you have a breach, a scratch, a cut, a wound.
So what about a virus like warts?
Yeah, even with warts, right, the viruses that cause warts, you may have a very tiny scratch that you don't even realize, and that's how they gained entry into your cells. Because your very outermost layer of your skin is actually dead cells, right, epithelial cells. The really gross thing is depending on how much dirt actually gets in your house. Most of the dust in your house is actually your own epithelial cells, right, that get sloughed off. Yeah, and then that's what the dust mites eat, is your epithelial cells. Yeah. Yeah. So, and microorganisms are on those dust particles too that get aerosolized into the air and you inhale. So, yeah. Dust is not a good thing. So, but it happens. So though many layers, right? And your outer layer, as I said, is dead. Those cells get filled with a protein known as keratin, which helps kind of create a sealant layer, right? And it's actually slightly waterproof and water resistant. And so for the most part, your skin is a relatively dry environment, but as we know, it varies from region to region on your body. And any microorganisms that land on the outside, when your skin cells are sloughed off, so are they, right? So in that case, those are just using you as a free ride, right? They're not actually invading you. Your cells are deeper cells. It's actually very tightly woven, right? There's not very much space between those cells. It's a really good barrier. But you do have openings in it, right? Your transients, as I said, are just going to be laying on the top, this epidermis layer, this mostly dead layer. The ones, your normal flora, are actually residing in your hair follicles and sometimes in your sweat glands. Not so much in the sweat glands because what's a component of your sweat that would impede microbial growth? Sweat is what? Salty. Salty. Right? It's salty. Right? That high salt content, right, is going to impede most microbial growth. Your sebaceous glands, on the other hand, the oil glands that are associated with your hair follicles, that it's produced so that the hair will slide out of the follicle, that's a food source for some microorganisms. So when you get infections of the hair follicle, right, zits, pimples, blackheads, right, and they're all the same. They're all the same thing. It's just whether it's encased or not encased, right? Whether it's open to the air or not. And you actually should not pop them, right? It just creates more tissue damage, right? Although good luck trying to get somebody not to do that. But when you do that, remember that pus that's in here, containing the organisms. So then you're just spreading it to other places of your skin. Your best option is a little triple antibiotic ointment, right? Put it on there, right? It's a bacterial infection, right? So antibiotics typically will help. Good old triple antibiotic ointment, right? Put it on there 2 or 3 days at max. It'll go away. The problem is that if it doesn't bust to the surface, right, you can get the formation of abscesses. And that's where, you know, your immune system, again, isn't able to take care of it. The influx of the cells, they're trying to maintain it in that area until it actually bursts to the surface. It may continue to head inward and be a source of infection within your tissue, right? So any types of damage to the skin, right, you always want to keep an eye on. It can become a much more serious infection. For some people, the reason why you're more prone, because all of us are exposed to these bacteria that cause zits, acne, and whatever. So some of us just produce more of the oily substance, produce more food, therefore you have more microorganisms growing, right? It's really actually as simple as that, right? So there's different ways to control that oil production, right? Different medications and whatnot. But it all stems from these sebaceous glands, these oil glands, which are really necessary, right, for the hair. We're completely covered in hair, even where you can't see it, very fine hairs, right? That's a characteristic of being a mammal, right, are these hairs. So your mucous membranes and your digestive tract is actually an external environment. It's a tube that goes right straight through your body. Even though, you know, it's inside of our body, we consider it inside of our body, but in truth, it's really an external environment to your body. And your body treats it as such. But because it is an area where stuff can enter into your body even further, right, truly into the internal part of your body, it can be a source of infection. So that tube that completely lined in mucus, right, because it's open to the environment, right, we have to have it. So as long as something goes in one end and completely out the other, it's good, right? And some things that happens with, right? But it's when it gets into that environment and then spreads out of the digestive tract, right, into the body tissues that you can have serious infection. Your respiratory tract as well. This is not a tube though, right? It does end. So because of that, we have added protection. Other than just the mucus, you have ciliated cells, which will beat and actually move that mucus up into your larynx, your trachea, up your trachea, your windpipe, right, to your pharynx, which is your throat, right? It's a scientific name for your throat, which is then, of course, attached to, right, the esophagus, the stomach, and the stomach acids are really good at destroying things. So the same is true for your head, right? Your nose is your filter. You have little hairs in there, lots of mucus. You're actually meant to breathe through your nose, not your mouth, right? Because it warms, moistens, and filters the air you breathe. Same thing, that mucus is going to go down your throat, right? And when you have infection, you produce more of it because you're trying to trap that stuff that's there. You're trying to move it along, right, down the digestive system out of the body, right? And hopefully it doesn't get further in than your respiratory tract. So your urogenital tract as well, bathed in mucus, right, to help prevent entry into the body. Your eyes are bathed in tears. Those tears go down ducts right here, your nasal lacteal ducts, your tear ducts, right? And so that when you overproduce, right, your tears will run down your face. But most of the time, you're always producing tears. It's just not running down your face. It's going down those ducts, right into your nose. Then right into your digestive system, right, to be eliminated out the body. So the salt, as we said, in the perspiration helps keep those sweat glands from being infected and the skin in general. But we know that there are some organisms that can resist salty environments. Lysozyme is an enzyme that we talked about previously, right? It can destroy peptidoglycan, that cell wall component of bacteria. This is found in your tears, in your saliva, in your mucus, inside some of your phagocytic cells, peroxidase enzymes, also in your saliva, right? These help break down hydrogen peroxide and actually produce toxic forms of oxygen. So it's very damaging to the pathogens. Lactoferrin is a special substance that you produce. It's also found in your saliva. Ferrin refers to iron. Lacto referring to the fact that you secrete it, right, in your secretion, in your saliva. It binds to iron because iron is a very important mineral for microbial growth. Right? We don't want them to get it. Right? So this binds to the iron to help sequester it and keep it away from them. We produce in our blood transferrin. Part of the reason why we produce that is to transport the iron through our blood, because iron isn't very soluble in liquids, right? That particular, your blood is mostly water. It's not very soluble in water. But the other thing, too, is it helps protect it from being picked up by microorganisms. Now, of course, there's some microorganisms out there. We saw how they can destroy red blood cells, right? I brought in those blood agar plates for you guys. They have made special enzymes so they can get at a very rich source of iron in our body, our red blood cells, right? Associated with our hemoglobin. That's actually the element that holds on to oxygen, binds to oxygen, is our iron. So we don't want them getting it. We can make specialized proteins that can actually insert into the membranes of microbes, of bacteria and fungi and protozoa, right? So it's like stabbing them, right, with little needles. The stomach itself, as I said, is very acidic. This is very good at destroying things. It also, the main purpose is protein digestion in our stomach. But it doesn't matter. If a bacteria gets in there, you'll digest it just like it's food. Right, you'll destroy it. It's only things that we ingest that can get past those stomach acids, or you ingest so many we don't kill them all, right, that get into the small and large intestine, and that's when you have problems. The continual flushing action of your bladder helps keep your urethra, right, that opening, and the bladder itself free of infection. Usually you have bladder troubles when you don't urinate enough. Drink plenty of water, right? Pee often. That's the best way to not get a bladder infection, right? And women, we've got the problem that urethra is really short, right? Men, it's got to travel a little bit further up there to get to the bladder. But same is true for both men and women, right? Lots of water. Pee often. Right? Because the worst case scenario is it can travel from the bladder to where? Up the ureters to your kidneys that actually produce the urine, right? The bladder is just a storage vessel for the urine, right? That's the worst case scenario, right? When you end up with kidney infection. You definitely do not want that. And then for females too, right? The vagina, the uterus, the fallopian tubes are actually open to the abdominal cavity, right? So stuff can travel all the way up the vagina, up the uterus, up the fallopian tubes, and infect the abdomen. So our body, right, has the mucus, has the protection to hopefully keep things from traveling inward for the body. So our normal flora, these guys that are normally there, right, how they help protect us, right, the bacteria that are already present, right, in your nasal passages, on your skin, for women in the vagina. Because they're there taking up those spaces, when the pathogenic organism comes along, there's no place for them to attach. There's no parking spot. There's no place for them to take up residence. And then our body itself, the organisms that grow there are going to produce substances that are going to compete, right? So it's like at the beginning of the semester, right? Good luck trying to find a parking spot unless you get here early, right? There just aren't enough spots. Well, if your normal bacteria or normal fungi are taking up all those spots, there's no place for the bad guys, right? No place for the people that don't come early. Okay? Also, they're going to produce substances, right? Propion bacterium degrade the lipids, right? That sebum, that oily substance that you produce, they produce fatty acids that are toxic to other microorganisms. Colistins are particular substances that E. coli produces in your intestinal tract. And it apparently is damaging to other microorganisms, bacteria, fungi that might want to grow there. Lactobacillus in the woman's vagina produce acid, right? When you have disruption, right, when these guys go away for one reason or another, then you're more prone to infection, right? So there are specific infections that are actually linked to a disruption in your normal flora. So Clostridium difficile is a spore former. It is present in the environment, but most people don't get this infection in their intestines because there's no space for that organism to take up residency. It's when there's a serious disruption to that person's flora and normal bacteria that live in their intestines that usually this one's able to take up residency. The bad news with this one, it's an extreme toxin producer and destroys the lining of the intestines. So it can be any number of reasons on why this would happen. So one of the ways, other than antibiotic treatment, that they try and recover from this type of infection is they'll actually put someone from that household's feces in your intestinal tract, right? Transplant, get the normal good bacteria back in that system. For women, right, vagina, having a quote-unquote yeast infection. This is when there's disruption to those bacteria, those lactobacilli, and other bacteria that usually keep the yeast that are there anyways under control. It's when the bacteria have been eliminated, whether from antibiotics or you've created a very rich environment. Diabetics have real serious problem with yeast infections because yeast love sugar. If you give them lots of sugar, they overgrow. And that's what a yeast infection is. It's an overgrowth of the normal flora, the normal yeast, those fungi that you have associated with your body. Right? Obese people will have difficulties where in the folds of the skin, right? This moisture, right, and this warm environment really, it will create a much better environment for the overgrowth of these normally occurring yeasts. Right? That's why it's really important to keep it clean and dry, right? Because they love warm, moist environments. Good luck with the vagina, right? It's always warm and moist, right? Just keep a normal balance, right? And if you don't, we have ways of getting the balance back, right? Okay, so it's a fact of life, right? It's a rich environment for microbial growth. So, the cells. We've mentioned some of these cells already, right? And we classify them in different groups based on some of their characteristics. So if you've taken anatomy and physiology too, right, you learned about granulocytes. You look at these under the microscope. And they're named such because they have these granules in them. These lysosomes, right? These digestive enzymes, different ones have different enzymes, like he was saying earlier. Well, which one has the histamine, right? And so because they have those different substances inside those lysosomes to digest and destroy different microorganisms, they stain differently under the microscope. And that's actually how they ended up with their names. Neutrophils, their granules stain kind of neutral. It's hard to see them depending on the stain. Eosinophils stained with the eosin dye that's used in the staining procedure. And so they come out the color of the dye, which is like an orangey red color. Basophils, these guys, their granules stain basic, so they end up being bluish purple. So all these guys were named after the fact, right, that they contain these granules that stain differently. Your mononuclear phagocytes, mononuclear referring that their nucleus stays intact, unlike when you look at your neutrophils and notice all of their names end in "phil." I always remember they're filled with granules, right? All your granulocytes are filled with granules, right? And the name tells you what type of granules. Your mononuclear phagocytes, their nucleus stays intact, okay? Where for your eosinophils and your basophils and all those guys, their nucleus becomes multi-lobed, right? Becomes deformed. Your monocytes are what these guys are called in your blood. But they differentiate into the other cell type that we know as macrophages when they're in your tissues. And these guys are always in your tissues. Unlike neutrophils, remember, they only go there during what? Inflammation, when they're being called there. Your dendritic cells, right? These are very specialized, important group of cells, believed to be derived from the macrophage monocyte lineage. And then you have your lymphocytes, which we won't get into real details on these guys until we get to our adaptive immune response, because they're paramount to that response. And there are 3 subsets of lymphocytes. And under the microscope, you can't tell the difference in the staining technique that we use. You'd have to use a specialized staining technique to be able to tell the difference between these guys. They're typically called B cells or B lymphocytes, T cells, and then, of course, my favorite, natural killer cells. Right? Under the microscope, you can't tell the difference between these 3. You would just know it as a lymphocyte. Now, some people say leukocytes. That's a general term for all white blood cells. Don't get that confused with lymphocytes. I tend not to use leukocyte, right, because of that problem, right, of sounding like lymphocyte. So, I'm almost out of time, huh? So, we'll talk about the cells next time. And hopefully we'll get to complement system as well.